Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Republicans in the House have been wrangling and trying to get legislation across the line with a historically small majority. And that math problem for them looks like it is only going to get worse in the short term. After the expulsion of George Santos, they are down one Republican, and another is soon leaving, a notable one, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. He announced in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that he has decided to depart the House at the end of the year to serve America in new ways. And Monet, any thoughts on McCarthy's legacy, his resignation from the House? And it seems like that will only make the job for the new Speaker, Mike Johnson, a little bit harder as he loses one more vote as we go towards these battles on getting the government funded.
Yeah, I think the best thing that you can say about McCarthy is to give him credit for the debt ceiling deal that he was able to strike with President Biden. Going into that process, obviously, he was facing a ton of opposition from the more conservative wing of his own party, and it seemed like it might be impossible to actually be able to put out something that both House Republicans would vote for and also that Democrats and the president would be willing to approve. In the end, he was able to get that done, and it actually did improve policy a little bit around the edges. We got a little bit more spending restraint for the coming year and also got work requirements attached to a lot of the social spending. So it was a real conservative win, despite the fact that he was working with such a small majority. But other than that, between the fact that he had a very hard time wrangling his own party and the fact that obviously Democrats controlled all the other avenues of power in Washington, you can't really say that Speaker McCarthy finished his tenure with any major accomplishments. And I think from his perspective, it makes perfect sense that he would rather resign and return to the private sector than continue to be a backbencher serving in the chamber where he was unable to hold the confidence of his own party. Obviously, he's been known throughout his career as a master fundraiser and also a great recruiter of candidates for the Republican Party. I believe that it's likely he's going to be setting up some kind of shop where he'll be able to raise money to continue those goals, and he'll want to be able to have the flexibility of working outside of the constraints of being in Congress. So certainly it does hurt the current House Republican majority that he's going to be leaving at the end of this month, because that means their margin is just a little bit smaller. We'll see with some of the coming legislative battles how much of a difference that makes. I'm sure Mike Johnson, despite the fact that he's downplayed in public, is not thrilled to have his wiggle room shrunk even a little bit more. But likely they'll find a way to make that work. And I'm sure Johnson is preparing to make sure that he's able to have his majority on board for whatever the coming votes are.
With those two absences, according to an analysis in the Hill newspaper, that means Republicans will have 220 votes to 213 for Democrats and a 3-vote cushion on party line votes, the majority then dropping from 218 of the House to 217. And so that is a very thin margin, and it is not hard for me to imagine how that could matter in some of these close votes to come. At the very least, it gives anybody who's on the bubble all the power to make demands of what they want to see and what they'll require in a piece of legislation in order to get their vote. The other retirement that was announced this week is somebody who's saying they won't run for re-election, Congressman Patrick McHenry of North Carolina. He has been in the House since 2005, but he became most famous nationally. His role recently in wrangling the House as acting speaker in that 3-week period when Kevin McCarthy was deposed and the House was struggling to replace him. Bill, this I think is notable because I think Patrick McHenry is generally seen as somebody who is a serious workhorse, a member who cares about policy, who thinks about economics, somebody who is in need at a time when the U.S. is $33 trillion in debt. We have entitlements that are about to go bankrupt. This is the kind of serious legislative member that I think the House needs. And Bill, I worry that a lot of those people have departed in recent years. And are they being replaced?
I don't know if they're being replaced. We'll see what happens with votes later. But yes, as you say, it's sad on the one sense that some of them are very good people. And the other effect is that they increase or narrow the margin of the Republican side. So we're going to have to see how it plays out. I mean, I believe that there should be votes for all these things because that is the basis of accountability, holding a vote, and including on authorizing an impeachment inquiry. Every person should have to weigh the pluses and minuses and stay where they stand. I think that's what our system is based on.
It's hard not to wonder whether the distraction and the internal party battles around this speakership fight have caused some people to lose faith in Congress as a place where they can actually get policy making done. And notable that Patrick McHenry is saying publicly, at least, that that's not the case. Here's part of his statement. There's been a great deal of hand-wringing and ink spilled about the future of this institution because some, like me, have decided to leave. Those concerns are exaggerated. I've seen a lot of change over 20 years. I truly feel this institution is on the verge of the next great turn, unquote. But Monet, it is not hard for me to wonder whether if you had a Republican conference that had been focused this year on getting things done instead of on internal party battles, that maybe Patrick McHenry would have stayed. And one more thing that I will raise as a bit of a hobby horse is that Congress has not given itself a raise in more than a decade, I think. And I think they've fallen behind on inflation, just as everyone else has. I've seen recent headlines about big law firms that are raising their starting salaries for new associates, first-year associates, to $225,000 a year. And that's not including a bonus. And compare that to Congress, where a lot of those guys are lawyers, and the Senate, it's $174,000 per year. And so if you are a young person who in a previous generation might have thought Congress is a place where maybe I aspire to go, and you start looking at your other options at law firms and elsewhere, it is less attractive, I think, as a career prospect than it used to be.
Well, let's start with Patrick McHenry's comments. I do think that he's trying to be charitable. It's funny, he's very much an institutional man, and I think as such, he doesn't want to be that guy who resigns and then immediately starts bad-mouthing his colleagues. So I think for the sake of comedy with his former colleagues, it made sense that he said, I'm not bashing the institution. There's still a lot of hardworking, smart people there getting things done. But it's very hard for me to believe that that's his actual view, obviously being in the difficult position that he was of being interim speaker after McCarthy was ousted and having an inside view on the disorder within his own party, and disorder that didn't seem to be oriented towards any actual political or policy end, mind you. This was infighting that was very much about status and recriminations. Matt Gaetz opposing Kevin McCarthy merely because they were of different styles and different camps, rather than there's something he really wanted the House to do that McCarthy wasn't doing. So I think that Patrick McHenry probably is quite cynical about the state of Congress, despite the fact that he decided to be a little bit more reconciliatory in his comments. But more broadly, I agree with you. It makes sense for members of Congress to be well paid. You want to have talented people who have options being willing to take that job. Obviously, they're in a difficult political situation of not wanting to pay themselves so much that the public thinks that Congress is something people do to enrich themselves, but also paying enough that people are willing to make the sacrifice to enter that field. It's possible that, as you mentioned, the current pay rates are a little bit low and haven't kept up with rising wages and inflation in other industries over the course of the past few years. I expect that eventually they'll get around to updating that. That probably won't be popular in the public's eyes whenever they do it, but for the good of the country, in some ways, it makes sense for them to be well compensated. And so I'm sure they'll update that before too long.
Thank you, Monet and Bill. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.